evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Mahoning Drive-In Theater, the largest single-screen drive-in in the United States. We're certainly glad you could be with us this evening, and don't forget the concession stand is open with all kinds of great things to eat and drink.
Welcome back to another episode of Mahoning Drive-In Radio. Mark here, General Manager at the Mahoning, and your host today for episode 2 of Canon Corner. That's right, we have Austin Trunick, author of the Canon Film Guide, Volume 1, and now Volume 2, covering the years 1980 to 84 in Volume 1 and 85 to 87 in Volume 2. And we are here to talk about 2 films that we have upcoming at the Mahoning Drive-In Theater. First will be The Apple from 1980, the deeply respected and revered musical from Canon Films. That'll be part of our Catherine and Kelli Save the World event. And then we have Charles Bronson returning once again to clean up the streets in Death Wish 3 from 1985. That is part of Exhumed Films Action Adventure Weekend. So welcome back, Austin. How are you?
Well, I'm great. Thank you for having me back.
So we had a great time, and listeners have given us very good feedback on our first sit down where we discussed at length Life Force, which I just saw last weekend on the big screen in the international cut, and it was fabulous. And I have never seen The Apple.
In 1994, the world is controlled by one power. The Apple is success. The Apple brings you everything.
What about happiness?
The Apple is the temptation. The Apple is the experience. The Apple is the forbidden fruit. The Apple takes your soul. Now, a special experience in movie-going entertainment. The Apple.
And it's a movie that seems like lately it's been getting a bit of a revival. It's showing up in theaters more and more often. So I had never heard of it for many years. And then it started to get this cult following, and oh my God, have you seen The Apple? You have to see The Apple. And now that it's playing theatrically so often, including on 35 millimeter at our own Mahoning Drive-In Theater, I'm going to see it for the first time on the big screen. So how did The Apple come to be?
Well, The Apple is a pretty pivotal film in Canon's early history. This was one of the first big movies that they produced. Golden Globus, the Israeli producers who came in and bought Canon, that they produced for the US market. This was going to be Canon's first big major feature. And it is a very, very different movie. If you were to look at all of the dystopian, sci-fi, biblical musicals set in 1994 in the music business, that's probably the best of them.
And it's some pretty stiff competition in that running too. So it's nice to know that Canon was able to, get to the top of the heap on that one.
Right. So yeah, it's interesting because Canon was always with Golden Globus at the helm on top of trends, or if they weren't like slightly ahead of them, as they were in like the ninja movies and with Breakin' and Breakin' 2, the breakdance films, they were slightly behind them. And I think that's sort of where The Apple falls. In the 70s, you had musicals were really changing. You had some great adult themed ones in Cabaret, Rocky Horror Picture Show, all that jazz, and some weird ones, The Wiz and Tommy. But by the late 70s, while The Apple was starting to cook, you have Saturday Night Fever comes along, and it's a movie that it sort of is the harbinger of 2 things. You have the disco musical and the jukebox musical. The musical's made to sell soundtracks. Saturday Night Fever came out, it had a great beachy soundtrack, it sold 16 million copies, and then Hollywood started looking at movies as really a way to sell a soundtrack. And you get, in the late 70s, they sort of enter this dark period of musicals where you get things like Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, Can't Stop the Music, Thank God It's Friday, and even ones that aren't selling the soundtrack, you still have Xanadu, you have even non-disco musicals like Grease and Fame. They have those disco theme songs stuck on the soundtracks to really help push those. So The Apple was going to be Canon's huge musical. That's at least what Menachem Golan thought he was making. They were so confident that it was going to come out and the soundtrack was going to sell Saturday Night Fever numbers that they actually formed their own label to put the soundtrack out, put a 12-inch disco like dance mix single out for the song Coming, which is a very infamous song from the soundtrack.
It wasn't CSO Records, was it?
No.
Okay.
Nope, Canon Records, and it's actually there. It's a shame they didn't release more because they've got the big, beautiful Canon logo on a red label
I
in
was
white.
just gonna ask. Oh, that's fantastic.
Oh, it looks so cool spinning on the turntable. But they put out this was their biggest one. All the rest were theme songs from some of their very other early movies. You have New Year's Evil, and I believe a track from Schizoid. But yeah, so this was what they thought they were making. The Apple began as it was written for the stage by married Israeli pop singers Kobe and Iris Recht, and it was just too expensive to produce on stage. It was going to be as a Hebrew musical in Israel, so they took it to Menachem Golan, who before they came to the United States, they were Israel's most successful movie producers, but also Menachem Golan had a long history on stage before he went to movies, usually mounting Hebrew versions of famous Broadway musicals at the time. But they took it to him, and his idea was to stage it as a film, and he pretty much completely rewrote it. Outside of some of the characters and the story ideas and story beats, the Menachem Golan got his hands on it, and this became very much a Menachem Golan script.
Now, he had been a director for a while before this. I mean, now when people hear his name, they just think he was one of the guys behind Canon, but he was also a director. How robust a filmography did he have?
He had a very robust filmography. He had been directing since the early 60s at this point, and he was pushing them out really almost on an annual basis. But you look at some of these early films, and he had some hits, especially when you look at the stuff he did in the 1960s in Israel. Hebrew films. Casablanca, actually 1974, was a musical that they did predating this, but was one of the best, most attended, one of the biggest homegrown hit they had ever had. And another one of the notable films that he had done after that was Operation Thunderbolt, which was very Delta Force-like. It had Klaus Kinski in it and Sybil Danning, so some Western actors. But this film was actually nominated for the Best Foreign Film Oscar. So it's interesting that they had a lot more, I think, critical success, or at least international respect before they came to Canon, based on what they were able to do to build Israel's film industry up so much.
I'm surprised he didn't more often bill himself in his later directorial efforts as Oscar-nominated director. You would have think with their marketing savvy, that would have been plastered on everything.
They definitely, I mean, the movies they just produced without his directing, they had a lot of ones that went up for the best foreign language feature, which is impressive. Not movies that people know and remember these days so well, but they were, I think one of the first pictures that ever ran in the LA Times of Menachem Golan was him standing with Francois Truffaut in 1964, because they had movies, or sometime in the 60s, because they had movies competing at the Oscars that year.
That's fascinating. How far into the Golden Globus ownership of Canon was the Apple?
Well, the Apple was one of their first. So they bought the company in 1979, and they started advertising their first 10 films, and the Apple was among one of those movies. So they had bought the company in 79. They shot the Apple in late 79, from September to December 1980, or 1979, and then they released it the following year. So very early. It's, I think, within the first 50 pages of my book. So there are only a few that came before it. What's funny about the Apple is it had this, obviously people who have seen the Apple know that it didn't have the huge commercial appeal that they had hoped for. It wasn't the next Saturday Night Fever by any means. But infamously, the film premiered at the Montreal World Film Festival, and Canon was so excited about this movie coming out, and they were sure it was going to be a hit, that they had handed out copies of their Canon Records pressed soundtrack album to the audience as they came in. And very famously, not long into the film, people started opening the records, removing the vinyl, and throwing it at the screen like frisbees. Menachem Golan was so torn up by this that this is how the story has been told, but he went up to his room at the hotel just so distraught and almost jumped out the window that Yorm had to talk him down.
Wow.
Because he was just had his hopes pinned so high on this movie being the thing that would break them into Hollywood and be this huge hit, that when those soundtracks started being used as frisbees and being thrown at the screen, he couldn't take it. But he clearly grew a much thicker skin following that experience, based on all of the Canon movies that were torn apart by critics and
it's funny.
and audience reviews.
my knowledge of the movies and going to the movies, and I was a pretty film focused savvy kid and watched a lot of TV. So I saw the TV ads, and this is a movie I never heard about until years later, until seeing it, maybe seeing the video cover. Even that I don't remember seeing. It really wasn't until people were talking about cult movies or bad movies or whatever that I started hearing about the Apple. I don't remember ever seeing like a TV spot for this. What kind of a US release did this get?
It wasn't a large one. I mean, it did play in theaters. It did travel around the country, but more notably, it did not get much of a video release. And that is where I think most people saw Canon movies during the 1980s. The video deal they had was with Paragon Video, who has some beautiful like VHS tapes of the star on them and such cool designs. But it's very scarce for any VHS collectors listening out there. That's one of the more scarce Canon releases to find, and that was it. So not until it got its DVD release circa 2000, sometime in the early 2000s, did people sort of just catch on and see how weird this thing was.
Yeah, I haunted, again, the video store was the candy store for me as a kid, and I scanned the boxes. I probably, if they had filed it in musical, I probably wouldn't have seen it, because that was one of the few sections I didn't really pay any attention to when I was a kid. But yeah, I don't think I saw anything until it was DVD. And was it not an MGM DVD release?
No, MGM did do the DVD release.
Okay.
There. Yeah.
That was always funny to me too, that this once grandly prestigious studio became the owner of like the AIP movies and the Canon movies. So you got the Roaring Lion that adorned Gone with the Wind and Wizard of Oz and all these classics that's sitting atop, the Apple.
Mm-hmm. The Apple it's one of these movies. It's two things that I think really has going for it. Some of the songs are actually very catchy, even if the lyrics are goofy or very, very thinly veiled innuendos for something else. There's a song about speed, which is called Speed, but it's about speed, but it's trying not to be about the drug speed, like amphetamines and things like that. But it's trying its hardest not to be. And it's very funny in how badly it fails. And then there's a song called Coming, which is, it's exactly about what it's. I don't know if I feel weird even repeating some of the lyrics.
That's okay.
Okay, it's I
get what you're saying.
Yeah, it's a song that it's filthy, and there's so many choreographed dancers basically doing this Bubsy Berkeley performance of the Kama Sutra in these golden like underwear, and it's wonderful, and something I'm excited that you're having this for the Kathy and Kelli weekend.
Oh, and it's excellent. And Catherine Mary Stewart will be there in person to either explain, answer for, or laugh along with the rest of us for this.
Yeah, she's got some great stories about it. You're gonna have fun with her there, and I think the most adorable thing that I got from her for this book is her saying that she didn't realize how filthy some of these songs were at the time she was making the movie. She was just that young and innocent. It was not until much later that she realized, oh no, this is a ballad about drugs that I'm dancing to, or like this song is, yeah.
And most of what I know about this is loose, cheap talk on the street. It's just the things people have said about how outrageous the film is. And I've seen the trailer, and it really, the visual style looks very, to my mentality, it's like a mix of like The Wiz and the musical numbers in the Saturday Night Fever sequel, Staying Alive. It's just a lot of strange clothing and makeup and sort of futuristic. And it's set in what year?
1994.
1994, and a more accurate portrayal of 1994 you'll never see. For anybody who wasn't alive in 1984, we'll point them to the Apple and say, this is what it was like.
It's such an arbitrary year, other than maybe they didn't want to call it 1984, because they draw comparisons obviously to another dystopian like set piece of science fiction, but 1994, and it's such the canon version of 1994 still banks on 14 years into the future when they film this, that disco would still be this big driving force in pop culture, but also that the primary counterculture would still be hippies, like very classic stereotypical 60s flower power hippies, being these sort of the good guys in this musical, who by 1980 were already pretty passé.
My friends and I, when we were in film school, we realized with as many films that we love, we'll slap a date on the future. And we realized the best way really to do it is either to just say at the beginning of the film, the future, or something like 15 years from now. So like whenever you watch it, because it becomes a joke once you hit that year that almost no movies are accurate to that. So it's nice to know that the Apple continues that fine tradition of totally getting the future wrong.
Mm-hmm. My favorite is the old Max Headroom set 20 minutes into the future.
Yes.
That's such a perfect way of handling it. Yeah, the Apple is such a fun movie though. Between the crazy costumes, the catchy songs, innuendo-filled songs, and you have some pretty great villains. You have Vladek Scheibel. I'm gonna butcher his name. He was a chess player in From Russia with Love. Kronstern. I'm butchering his Bond.
That's
name.
really funny because the film we're going to talk about next is part of an action adventure weekend during which we are playing From Russia with Love. So
perfect.
The mystical ties between the Apple and James Bond.
Yes. Everything connects, it seems like. Once you get to canon, you can kind of branch it out. You can play the Kevin Bacon game. And
6 degrees of canon films, yeah.
Mm-hmm. But I am so excited for everybody who is seeing this either for the 20th time or for the first time on the big screen.
It sounds like it will be an ideal group viewing experience, especially after, now we're showing this on Saturday, June 11th on 35 millimeter, which is what we do. And it will follow Night of the Comet, which is a fun 80s sort of horror comedy with both Catherine Mary Stewart and Kelly Maroney in it. And so I think everybody will be on a nice up vibe from Night of the Comet, and then they will get sucker punched by the insanity of the Apple. And I presume Catherine will stay there and watch it with us, and that's going to be quite the experience.
Charles Bronson, Death Wish 3. First, they took the streets. Then they took it all. But their next target may be their last victim. Charles Bronson, where there is no justice, there can only be vengeance. Charles Bronson, Death Wish 3, rated R.
Starts Friday at a theater near you.
So speaking of early 80s musicals, when I think early 80s fabulosity, my mind immediately goes to Charles Bronson. And on Exhumed Films is doing an action adventure weekend with us on June 24th through 26th. June 24th is Bronson night. So you get the mechanic, you get Mr. Majestic, and then that tunes you up for the sucker punch that is Death Wish 3. Now, this was the, if you are good with math, third film in the Death Wish franchise that I believe went to 5 movies over time. And directed by Michael Winner, who had directed, did he direct the first Death Wish? I know he directed the second one.
He did. He directed the first 3.
And so tell us how Death Wish 3 came about, because you had Death Wish, which was this great classic vigilante film based on a book. You had Death Wish 2, which was changed, like sort of went to a different, shift coasts, right? Death Wish was New York. Death Wish 2 was LA, if I recall. Yes. And then we have Death Wish 3, where once again, Paul Kersey is put in a position where he needs to clean up the streets.
Yeah, they kept finding ways to give Kersey a reason to do that. Death Wish is, again, another franchise that is very, very important to Canon's history, but not one that Canon started. They had a habit of getting sequel rights to do sequels to movies that they had nothing to do with starting the franchise. But Death Wish 2, originally Canon, again, when we spoke a little bit about this during our Apple discussion a moment ago, but when Golden Globus bought the company in 1979, the first thing they did was take out these giant advertising spreads in the trades and different magazines to talk about their first 10 movies they were going to produce. Many of those movies never got produced. The Apple did. One of them, another one was a sequel to Death Wish. The problem with that was that Canon did not have the sequel rights to make Death Wish. And most of the people involved with the first Death Wish movie, the first time they were hearing about there being a sequel to Death Wish was through the trade ads that Canon took out. So Dino De Laurentiis, who had the rights and he was involved with the first one, he had basically no idea that he did not think there was any interest in there ever being a Death Wish sequel. That the first story had really played its course. So he had his lawyers call up Cannon and basically strong arm him to paying six figures for the rights to the sequel. At that point, Cannon's hand was forced. They'd already paid this much. When they approached Bronson didn't want to do a sequel. But when they upped their offer to $1.5 million, that was enough money that could get Bronson to come in and do whatever at that point. So they'd already invested $2 million in the star in the movie and the rights based on this one ad that they took out before checking into the rights or having any legal staff check it out. But it was a surprise hit for Cannon. Death Wish 2, they shot it and released it. I mean, it was just almost a carbon copy of the first movie.
But it upped the sleaze factor quite a bit.
Yes. Filthier, more violence even. It's hard to believe that. But for a movie that was starring a actor who, at that point was in his 60s, a sequel to a movie that had come out 8 years earlier, which is another crazy part. It did $16 million at the box office in the US, which is a crazy amount for Cannon, and almost another $30 million elsewhere across the world, and with video deals and such worked in. And that was massive. That was when Cannon had gone from taking a risk on the Apple, kind of taking a huge hit on that, and then mostly making tiny exploitation movies, sex comedies and slashers. And Death Wish came out, was a huge hit, and they could really start upping the stakes. The number of movies they made, the make the budgets a little larger. People started to take them seriously after Death Wish 2. Cannon couldn't let anything be, though. So if there was something that was successful, they had to look into the sequel rights or look into making a sequel. And Death Wish 3 was inevitable, really.
And was that 4 years after Death Wish 2?
Death Wish 2 was 82, and then Death Wish 3 was 85. So 3 years, pretty quick. But they moved it back to New York. Part of it's shot in East New York, neighborhood of Brooklyn. Most of it is shot in London, though, closer to Michael Winner's home.
To me, it really showed that it wasn't shot in New York.
Yes.
I watched it for the first time a few months ago. I got a DVD. I think it was a Blu-ray from Umbrella Entertainment in Australia that had 2 and 3 together, and it had an alternate longer cut of 2. And 2 was 2, and then I saw 3, and some people really like 3. For a lot of people, 3 is their favorite, and it just felt so like it took place in some alternate universe to me.
It is. I mean, London doesn't stand in very well for New York. They're just Paul Talbot, who I know you'll have for that night of your Bronson films. Incredible author, also a super nice guy, but the most knowledgeable man on Bronson on this planet. He does a commentary on one of at least on the US, I think it's the Scorpion Blu-ray that was released here, where he sort of points out, he's like, okay, so Bronson here's Charles is running around the corner. He's in New York, and he comes around the corner, and he's in London, and he runs across the street. When he gets across the street, he's in New York again. And it's just a very funny, because for some of the scenes, they had to really cut it back and forth. And it's very obvious. It's very, very obvious.
And there were moments too, and again, I know a lot of people love this movie. There were moments where even the background extras were so, it looked like I was watching like a stage production somewhere, like just the people walking around the background. It felt so choreographed to make it look like it was a busy street when it was really this like desolate chunk of some place in England. It just, many aspects of the film, it took me out of the film because it seemed so like something was just off a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's even in the London scenes, the extras, if you are listening to it really closely, you've seen the movie a few times, but you hear these voices of these characters that walk by or have one line, and you can really hear the ADR in it, because so much of it was shot in London. No one sounded like New Americans. So I think Michael Winner, he went to like a local military base or something and hired 2 sailors, American sailors, to come and redub like all of these lines, so that the background extras that were shouting things and with their British accents went ahead and they could redub those. Yeah, so this actually has a link back to Life Force, because Don Jacoby was the screenwriter who handled Death Wish 3, and he had written Life Force with Dan O'Bannon for the Tobe Hooper Cannon production. He also wrote Invaders from Mars. And then he went on later to do Arachnophobia, the Jean-Claude Van Damme Double Team, and John Carpenter's Vampires are probably the things he's best known for. But a great screenwriter, but Death Wish 3 is one that he'd probably rather not be associated with, because Michael Winner rewrote it very, very heavily, just with Death Wish 2. but added a lot of the extra violence, the sexual assaults, and things that feel a little too much sometimes in Death Wish 3.
I know that was something that was discussed in the extras on the Blu-ray that I was watching. I know there was the Blu-ray I saw had this very interesting extended interview with Alex Winter talking about being one of the punk gang members in Death Wish 3. And I don't remember if it was him or somebody else, but some crew members were talking about how uncomfortable they were with the additional sexual assaults that were, I believe it was in this movie. It might have also been in 2. And Winter seemed to have a thing for that.
He did. Definitely. I feel that he used his movies to work out some kinks that he probably, there is some uncomfortable stuff, and it is a very recurring theme. It's hard to miss throughout his filmography.
I mean, most revenge movies have something like that. It's a very 70s thing overall to have that kind of assault in a movie. I used to joke, I mean, it's not a funny joke, but I used to joke that, that was part of what was required to get funding for a film in the 70s. There had to be a rape scene in there somewhere. And it's the kind of thing that if you're a fan of the genre that you kind of have to grit your teeth, roll your eyes, or fast forward through, because it's so recurring. But I always say with a revenge movie, the inciting incident has to be so awful and egregious an offense that you don't mind your hero just laying waste to everybody who had anything to do with it in the worst way possible. So it's sort of like I hate to say necessary evil with these sorts of movies, but it's something that's for a long time was always present. Now with Death Wish 3, my memory of the viewing that I had was that he's not like cleaning up the streets for a large duration of the movie. To me, it felt like a very long buildup, and then the rocket launcher or whatever that happened to be locked in a cupboard comes out, and then things start going crazy.
Yeah. Death Wish 3 has a very kind of funny premise, because in the first 2, it's Paul Kersey getting revenge for these terrible things that happened to his wife and daughter, and he's seeking out very specific thugs. In the first movie, it's like Jeff Goldblum and his gang, and in the second one, you have Lawrence Fishburne and a bunch of other thugs. In this one, it's this Brooklyn neighborhood that's full of old people, but overrun by this really awful gang that is just going around hurting them. The main one, Fraker, is played by Gavin O'Hurley, Chuck Cunningham from Happy Days, and son of Dan O'Hurley, who I know from Halloween 3 as the Silver Shamrock for the main villain in that. So it's a funny family line there. So Death Wish 3, Paul Kersey comes to Brooklyn, visit an old war buddy who's unfortunately murdered before Paul can get there. And Paul is sort of at first gets the rap because he's this suspicious person that comes from out of town to visit this just freshly murdered man. But while he's in prison, the cops recognize him basically as the Death Wish vigilante. And so rather than trying him for these crimes, all these murders, he is kind of famous, and the cops give him basically carte blanche to just go on a killing spree. He can clean up the entire neighborhood if he wants, just so long as he keeps the cops informed. So he basically becomes a police-sanctioned vigilante in this film. And you're right, much of the film is just a slow build-up. He has some sort of Kevin McAllister tendencies in this one, where he helps some old people set up traps in their house. There are a lot of traps that he's setting for these bad guys. But it's really a build-up to the end of the movie, which is just one gigantic war, basically an urban warfare. You have an endless number of gang leaders. You have Paul Kersey and his sidekicks and a bunch of old people joining in with their guns in this neighborhood war. You have motorcycles being wrecked. You have buildings blowing up. There's a little granny gets set on fire. It's insane, and it's just the most over the top, just bloodbath. It looks like the end of like a Rambo movie or something like that, except it's set in a small elderly ethnic neighborhood in Brooklyn.
The one moment I remember and sort of laughing when it came up was Martin Balsam says to, he's an old war buddy of Paul Kersey, and he opens a cupboard and he has like a machine gun or a grenade launcher or some ridiculous piece of hardware that he's like, oh yeah, they let me keep it after the war. It was something like that he just happened to have. And he's like, you might be able to use this, or it's time to get to work or whatever. But it is certainly more ridiculous than the previous 2 films.
Yeah, when he's not getting the gigantic machine guns from his buddy who's been keeping him in the closet since Korea. He's getting guns through the mail. That's the other thing that really strikes me as funny. There are so many scenes in Death Wish 3 of Charles Bronson going to the post office to mail order guns, which is just crazy. You know, he gets a bazooka through the mail. I mean, maybe in the night.
To be historically accurate, I believe that's how Lee Harvey Oswald got the Kennedy assassination rifle, that it actually was a rifle by mail. So there is historical precedent for that.
Well, there we go. Yeah, I wasn't mail ordering rocket launchers in the 80s, so I can't personally say whether that was whether that's realistic or not.
We were busy getting nunchucks and ninja stars from the back of Kung Fu magazines.
Absolutely.
Inspired by Cannon Films.
For sure. Cannon was, for me, definitely if I brought home a Cannon tape, whether with my dad or on my own, I would be trying to imitate whatever I saw in it afterwards. So
after you rented this, it was find me Soldier of Fortune magazine. Where can I order a bazooka through the mail?
Yes. Where can I find a revolver as large as my arm?
Well, it's funny, talking about this made me remember there was a movie I saw on TV as a kid. I just looked it up. It's called Siege from 1978, a TV movie that starred Martin Balsam. And it was about a group of senior citizens who had had enough of being terrorized by thugs and punks in their neighborhood, and they decided to fight back. And it's,
oh, wow.
When you were just recounting the plot to Death Wish 3, it made me think about that. I'm like, wow, Martin Balsam actually kind of had done this once before in this thing that, has long been forgotten. But, not Martin Balsam's first trip to the senior citizen revenge rodeo.
Yeah, I mean, there's I'm sure that you could probably program a full weekend of
Elder Revenge Weekend.
Yes. Make sure you have a senior citizen discount for that too.
It's like Cocoon with machetes. It's great. So Death Wish 3 received a theatrical release in the US. This is another that I don't honestly ever remember coming out at the time.
It did, and it opened at number 1 at the box office.
Wow.
It was one of 3 movies that Cannon had open at number 1 in 1985. So really it was the success of Death Wish 3 and these other films that really kind of allowed them to step up their game or attempt to step up into the next level of making movies with Over the Top and Superman 4 and Masters Universe and films like that in 1986 and 1987.
What would you say Cannon's prime was? Because this is around that, as you say, that time that I remember seeing the logo a lot and seeing the commercials on TV a lot, and the videotapes were everywhere. Was it like 84 to 87? Where were they, just firing on all cylinders, success wise?
I think you nailed it there. That was really the peak. 84 ended with them having 2 major successes. The 2 biggest, most profitable movies they had were Break-In and the first Missing in Action. As far as just, they were huge hits, made a ton of money for Cannon. By 1985, you had a lot of big name stars and big name directors starting to take them seriously. At the end of 84, they had done a movie with Cassavetes. In 85, they had Robert Altman. They had Andrei Konchalovsky. They had Franco Zeffirelli working on Otello for them. They had famously signed the napkin deal at Cannes with Jean-Luc Godard to make King Lear, written by Norman Mailer. So all these huge names kind of work with them. And then by the end of 85, you had Runaway Train, which was the Cannon movie to get Oscar nominations. But going in 1986, then they have deals with Sylvester Stallone for Over the Top, made him the highest paid actor in Hollywood for that for a brief time. They had deals with Al Pacino, 3 movies, Dustin Hoffman to do La Brava for them. So Cannon was really, really in a great spot right there at the beginning of 86. One of the other big things is they had money behind them. The investors felt confident. If you want to talk about the sudden fall of Cannon, you look at March of 1986, when you have articles in the trade papers that Cannon has a line of credit, investors willing to, and from a stock offering, they have basically $300 million to spend on movies, which is incredible for a company that mostly makes $1 to $5 million low budget films. That's just a lot to work with. By August of 1986, they were $100 million in debt. So that is March to August to lose $400 million. is, I'm not a financial person, but that seems bad. But a lot of it came from they made some very poor investments in some theater chains and facilities in the UK and buying up Thorn in My Eye. Breaking down what went wrong for Cannon would take a long time, but how fast things fell apart is just jaw-dropping.
Now, is that something you get into in volume 2 of the Cannon Film Guide, or is that being saved for volume 3?
I get into really the beginning of the end with volume 2, because like I said, things fell apart very, very quick in 1986. And by 1987, they had already so many balls in the air, plates spinning, that they were really yanking budgets from one production to send it into another. And you have films where endings couldn't be shot because Cannon cut the budget and cut their shooting schedule so they could put that money into something else that had more surefire bankability in their minds. But 87 is when things start to get really dark. By 1988, you'd already moved on to, outside of a few exciting highlights, thinking of specifically Bloodsport and the discovery of Van Damme, which kind of helped them out there for a little bit. But that was their straight-to-video era. Like, for so many movies were getting very tiny theatrical releases or video releases at that point, or cable premieres, rather than from 85 to 87, their movies were playing all over. They were getting serious screen time around the country.
Do you think that's more a result of the tastes changing, or the quality of their films, or the studios getting more of a lock on screens than in the past, where a lot of independent companies had a shot at getting into local theaters and multiplexes?
It's hard not to point at the decline in quality of their films. I think they lost a lot of confidence with movies that really kind of fell flat. Unfortunately, even looking at things like Life Force, where it was not a commercial success, but it played in a lot of places to disappointing returns. But then you can look at movies like Masters of the Universe or Superman 4, which definitely did not meet the expectations and were flops in every sense of the word.
Right.
The theater owners, I think, just lost a lot of confidence in Cannon product very quickly.
Was to sort of sidestep and backtrack a little bit, was this Bronson's first film? No, Death Wish 2 was Bronson's first film with Cannon.
He had also done 10 to Midnight in between.
Okay. Yes,
So,
which is a wonderfully sleazy film that we ran, that Exhumed Films actually ran a print of at our theater within the last 2 years.
oh, that's fun. That's one of my favorites of Bronson's Cannon period.
My memory was that it seemed like he hooked up with Cannon, and that was almost the only person he was working for a period of time.
Yeah, more or less in the 1980s, outside of just some the Evil Men That Men Do being one where he went off because Cannon didn't want to pay for the screenplay rights for it, and so they let someone else take it. But yeah, Bronson came to Cannon, and it was a mutually beneficial relationship for both of them, in my opinion. He got to make basically one movie a year. He was doing for them, and getting paid very well, getting paid up front, which is a big thing. But also he got to dictate a lot of the conditions for the directors. Like, he had Michael Winner do Death Wish 2 instead of Mahoning Drive-In. J. Lee Thompson, somebody who he liked, who got to keep working with him. And then he got to work with Jill Ireland on a few films. His wife and his children, some of his stepchildren, got to handle music. One of his stepson does some music in Murphy's Law. So Bronson was an age where, he was in his 60s at that point. And sadly, for a lot of this time that he was working with Cannon, he had a wife, Jill Ireland, who was very sick. She was battling cancer. So I don't think that he really, from talking to people who had worked with him, got the sense that he did not like being away from home. He'd rather be at home with his wife and his kids. So,
and funny enough, they lived about 3 towns over from where I grew up. I lived in New Hampshire. He lived in Vermont somewhere. And people would always talk about that. Oh, I saw Charles Bronson at the department store. Or I went to this town and I saw Charles Bronson. And I was always just like, that's insane. Movie stars don't live in the middle of nowhere where I live. And he is indeed buried not far from where I grew up.
I live in Connecticut. I actually did a drive up to, is it Windsor, Vermont?
I believe it is. Yeah, it's Windsor.
Yeah, to see the gravesite. And they have Bronson Road, which goes back to the ranch that he had lived on with Jill Ireland and his kids, the Rolling Horse Ranch. It's amazing that's the lifestyle he enjoyed. He enjoyed that, and I think he enjoyed that more than making movies. So The relationship with Cannon that he had was probably the next best thing to being retired completely.
Really? I mean, do one film a year that you have a good, healthy say in, and then that affords the life that you live, that you want for the rest of the year. That's great.
Yeah. So, and for Cannon, that was for until the very end, the last movies that they were making with him. All those movies made good money because they could sell them internationally and they could count on making back what they paid Bronson and much more.
And what was the last film he did for Cannon? Was it a Death Wish 5?
Well, Death Wish 5 was actually done for Mahoning Drive-In at 21st Century Films after Cannon, but the last one with the Cannon logo on it would have been Kinjite, The Forbidden Subject, which very, very, very sleazy Bronson movie.
That's what I've heard. I've still not seen that, but it's one that, again, as a video store kid, I remember the box covers for all of these.
Death Wish 5, yeah, they did 4, and then 5 followed Menachem to 21st Century, which 21st Century was pretty much just almost a branch off of Cannon at that point because it's so many of the same directors and Menachem overseeing it while Yorm's over at Cannon.
I saw one 21st Century film in the theater opening weekend, and that was the Robert Englund Phantom of the Opera.
Oh, wow.
It was a film that was advertised pretty heavily on TV, so they had a marketing budget for it. And it played at my little Claremont Triple Cinemas, this strip mall 3-screener. And one of my best friends and I went to go see it, and we were the only people in the theater that matinee. But we liked it. It was fun. But it is funny now that I look back. What, Captain America was a 21st Century?
It was. That's the one that I will always associate. First one that comes to mind for a 21st Century. That was that and the Dolph Lundgren Punisher were my two. Well, that was New World, but those were my two. That was my Marvel Universe growing up as as a young person into those Marvel comics.
As a person who loves exploitation B movies from the past, I feel like I missed the boat for the most part on most of it, seeing it theatrically just due to what my local theater got in my age. So it is something I reflect fondly on, that I was able to see, the 21st Century logo on a movie screen when it was brand new.
Those are movies that don't get many repertory screenings. So you may have been one of the first and last people to see that logo on a theater screen.
Once in a while, we'll play a print at the Mahoning Drive-In and on 35 as we do, and it'll be in really great shape. And I'll say that's because nobody has wanted to play it. And when we ran Masters of the Universe a few years ago, we ran Masters of the Universe on a double feature with Howard the Duck, and it was called Second Chance Weekend. And the idea was movies that tanked hard and people never liked, we're going to give them a second chance. And not many more people showed up the second time around, but it was really impressive and amusing that the Masters of the Universe print looked pristine. And I said, that's because no one has touched it since it came out.
And that's probably very close to the truth. I'm sure.
So once again, we have The Apple, directed by Menahem Golan, a Cannon classic musical. Let's say it was a Cannon classic musical from 1980. That's going to play as part of Catherine and Kelli Save the World, and that's screening on Saturday, June 11th at the Mahoning Drive-In Theater on 35 millimeter. And Austin, you said at one point to me off air that there might be a longer version of this that plays sometimes.
There is an alternate cut, and it has played in LA at least twice that I'm aware of over the years. What I believe it is perhaps the festival cut, the one they showed at the Montreal Film Festival. People who've never seen The Apple obviously won't notice any big differences, but people who are listening, coming to see The Apple, who have seen The Apple many, many times, will know some things. If you've listened to the soundtrack, the songs are longer. They're shortened in the movie. There's especially the song Coming, and there's a song Child of Love, which had entire choreographed sequences that were cut from the final film. My thoughts are that when this had this disastrous screening in Montreal where people were throwing stuff at the screen, that Menachem went back to the editing room with one of Cannon's editors and retold the movie. But it's one that I would love to see, and it's something that they seem to get when they rent The Apple on 35, and just sometimes it happens to be this alternate cut.
My guess is that it's entirely likely we'll get that, because I can't imagine that Park Circus, I believe is the company we'll be getting this from, has more than one printer that they lend out. I can't imagine the demand is so great that they would have more than one. And Park Circus also has been known to have in their possession longer cuts of films, or the European unrated version of a movie. I've been to theatrical screenings where we suddenly got a version of a movie, like a Hammer film, that had more nudity that was never seen in the US that way. So I guess chances are probably good that we'll be playing the festival cut of The Apple on 35 millimeter on June 11th. So if you're planning to come out to see The Apple, you're going to have a great time, and you might have an even more interesting and more exclusive experience than people who saw it in 1980 or on home video. And then on June 24th, as part of Exhumed's Action Adventure Weekend, we are screening Death Wish 3 that we've been talking about. That's third on the bill. It's a Bronson night. We have The Mechanic, Mr. Majestic, and then Death Wish 3. Saturday, June 25th, it is James Bond films in apparently original IB Technicolor prints, From Russia with Love, Goldfinger, and Thunderball. And then on Sunday, you get a single feature, but with that single feature, you get a dirty dozen. So that's going to be fun. Austin, so you have 2 books out right now that I cannot wait personally, honestly, to read. You have the Canon Film Guide Volume 1, which covers 1980 to 1984. Canon Film Guide Volume 2, which covers 1985 to 87. That's available on Amazon, I know, and probably anywhere finer books are sold. How can folks find you online to message you about further queries about the films of Golan Globus, or find these products?
Oh, please do. Please do message me with all of your questions. You can find me at Canon Film Guide on Twitter or on Facebook. It's all one word, at Canon Film Guide. And
for anyone interested in these upcoming shows at the Mahoning Drive-In Theater, or anything else we run more nights a week than not, different movies every night, all on 35 millimeter. Boogie on down to mahoningdit.com. And with that, we close another episode of the Canon Corner. We thank Austin Trunick for joining us, and we'll have him back every time he is willing to talk about a Canon film we are going to show. Until next time, we will see you at the drive-in.
Ladies and gentlemen, thanks again for coming out tonight to the Mahoning Drive-In Theater. We hope you'll come back and see us again real soon. The exit is on the right-hand side of the screen at the front of the field, and most importantly, have a very safe trip home. Good night, and God bless you.